The subway car rumbled through the underground tunnel, its fluorescent lights flickering slightly with each turn. The late evening crowd sat in exhausted silence, workers heading home, students lost in their phones, an elderly couple whispering to each other. The air was thick with the usual mix of metal, sweat, and tired resignation. Then the atmosphere shifted. 3 young men swaggered into the car at the last stop, their presence an instant disruption. Loud voices, sharp laughter. Their energy was different, aggressive, predatory. They scanned the passengers like wolves surveying a field of sheep. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered youth with a jagged scar across his cheek, smirked as he nudged his companions. A businessman in a suit flinched as they neared. A young woman clutched her purse tighter. A mother instinctively drew her child close. The tension thickened as the thugs circled their chosen targets, relishing the unease. In the farthest seat, an elderly man sat in stillness. His frail hands rested on his lap, fingers lightly intertwined. He seemed undisturbed by the growing chaos, his face calm, almost meditative. His name was Isamu Takeda, a quiet man barely noticed by others. A sharp bark of laughter erupted as one of the thugs snatched a book from an old professor's hands and tossed it across the car. Another knocked over a man's coffee, sending a dark stain spreading across the floor. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, their attention shifted to him, the old man in the corner. They sneered. Easy prey. But what they couldn't possibly know was that the man before them was no ordinary passenger. Isamu Takeda was once a master of the sword, a living legend of a forgotten era, and tonight they would learn what true strength really meant. Discover how wisdom and honor triumph over senseless violence. Subscribe now and don't miss this powerful story. The subway hummed along the tracks, the rhythmic clatter of steel against steel filling the car. The passengers were accustomed to the routine, their own quiet worlds of exhaustion, distraction, or thought. Some scrolled through their phones, others stared blankly ahead, waiting for their stop. Isamu Takeda sat near the back, his posture relaxed but dignified. He was a man of few movements, his breathing steady, his gaze calm, his faded brown coat draped over his thin frame, and his calloused hands rested lightly on his knees. To any observer, he was just another old man heading home. But the mood inside the subway had already shifted. The 3 young men who had entered at the last station now claimed the center of the car. Kenjiro, the tallest and most imposing of the group, leaned against a pole, his sharp eyes scanning the passengers. He was the leader, his movements confident, his smirk filled with arrogance. The scar on his cheek, a relic of past fights, twitched as he grinned. Beside him, Riku, wiry and restless, tapped his fingers against the metal railing, his eyes darting around like a snake looking for its next meal. And then there was Daiichi, broad-shouldered but slower, his presence more about brute force than wit. The 3 had no reason to fear anyone here. Kenjiro's voice broke the silence. "Look at this, a whole train of ghosts," he laughed, nudging Riku. "No one even looks up. Everyone just hopes we go away." He was right. The passengers avoided eye contact, pretending not to hear, until Riku decided to liven things up. With a flick of his wrist, he smacked a man's phone out of his hands, sending it skidding across the floor. The owner, a middle-aged salaryman, froze in place, his breath caught in his throat. "Oops," Riku said with mock sympathy. "You dropped something." The man hesitated. "Go on, pick it up," Daiichi added, his voice thick with menace. The salaryman glanced around, searching for help. No one moved. The subway, once filled with the passive hum of daily life, was now a pressure cooker of fear. A young woman instinctively hugged her purse. An elderly professor clenched the book in his hands. A man in his 20s shifted uncomfortably, gripping the strap of his backpack. The air grew heavier. Kenjiro stepped forward, picking up the phone. He turned it over in his hands, then met the owner's terrified gaze. "What's the password?" he asked. The man shook his head. Please, just give it back." Kenjiro's grin widened. Then, without warning, he crushed the phone beneath his boot, the glass shattering against the metal floor. The man gasped, but said nothing. He just swallowed his anger, his fear winning over his pride. Kenjiro chuckled. "That's what I thought. They were untouchable. Or so they believed." Near the back of the train, Isamu Takeda observed everything. He didn't flinch, didn't react, he simply watched. His gaze, sharp beneath the weight of age, followed every movement. He noted the way Kenjiro carried himself, the way Riku fed off his leader's cruelty. the way Daichi provided the muscle when needed. He studied their arrogance, their false confidence, and more importantly, he studied their weaknesses. He could feel the fear in the air, but he was not afraid. He had faced greater dangers, had seen true darkness. These boys were nothing more than shadows pretending to be storms, yet he remained still. Violence was no longer his way. But then Kenjiro turned and his eyes locked onto Isamu. A new target, a new game. "Hey, old man," Kenjiro called out, taking a few steps closer. "Haven't said a word, huh?" Isamu did not respond. Kenjiro grinned, too scared to even look at me. Still, Isamu remained silent, his expression unreadable. Riku smirked. "Maybe he's deaf. Or maybe he's just smart enough to keep his mouth shut." Daichi laughed. "Or maybe he's asleep." Kenjiro's grin faded. He didn't like being ignored, and so with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and grabbed Isamu's shoulder. In that instant, for the first time, Isamu moved, subtle, precise. The car continued its journey, the city flashing by outside, unaware that inside, something was shifting. A storm was coming, and for the first time that night, the hunters were about to realize they had chosen the wrong prey. Kenjiro's grip tightened on Isamu's shoulder, his fingers pressing into the old man's coat. The subway's overhead lights flickered for a brief second, casting fleeting shadows across their faces, but Isamu did not react. He remained still, as if the hand on his shoulder was nothing more than a passing breeze. His gaze was calm, unwavering. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like he hadn't even noticed the thug's attempt at intimidation. Kenjiro frowned. He was used to fear, expected it, relished it. But this wasn't fear. Riku leaned in with a smirk. "Maybe he's frozen in shock," he whispered. Daichi chuckled. "Or maybe he's already dead." Kenjiro's patience wore thin. He shook Isamu's shoulder slightly. "I asked you a question, Grandpa." Slowly, Isamu lifted his gaze and looked directly into Kenjiro's eyes. A flicker of something unsettled the younger man, just for a fraction of a second. He didn't know why, but the depth in the old man's stare felt different. It wasn't the empty, helpless look of a victim. It was the gaze of someone who had seen far worse things than him. A ghost of a memory stirred in Isamu's mind. The subway car blurred, and for a brief moment the metallic walls melted into the warm glow of lanterns. The rhythmic hum of the train was replaced by the distant clang of steel against steel. He was no longer an old man in a subway car, he was young again. He was standing in the courtyard of his master's dojo, the cold night air thick with the scent of rain and blood. The weight of a wooden training sword pressed into his palm as he faced his opponent. A towering warrior with unyielding eyes. His master. "You hesitate, Isamu," the older man's voice echoed in his memory. "That hesitation will kill you one day." The memory was sharp, crisp. He remembered the way his master's blade rushed toward his throat, how his body reacted on instinct, how he had countered, moved, flowed like water, and for the first time knocked his master's sword from his hands. The lesson had been clear. Strength alone was not enough. Control, precision, patience, that was the path of a true warrior. The subway lurched slightly, jolting Isamu back to the present. Kenjiro's grip on his shoulder was nothing compared to what he had faced before. The young thug scoffed. "Not so tough now, huh?" Isamu finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Your grip is weak." Kenjiro's smirk faltered. "What?" "Your fingers," Isamu continued, as if discussing something entirely mundane. "Too much tension in the wrist, too little pressure in the thumb. You lack control." A hush fell over the car. The old man's words had no aggression, no fear, just an eerie, knowing calm. Kenjiro snatched his hand away, his confidence flickering with annoyance. "You think you're some kind of wise old man, huh?" Isamu said nothing, but for the first time that night, Kenjiro felt small. Riku, sensing the shift, quickly stepped forward, trying to reclaim the power of the moment. He laughed, slapping Kenjiro's shoulder. "Come on, man, you're letting this geezer mess with you?" Kenjiro clenched his jaw, forcing a chuckle. "Yeah, whatever. Not worth our time." But as they turned their attention back to the other passengers, a strange tension remained in the air. The old man had unsettled them, and something deep inside Kenjiro told him this wasn't over. From his seat, Isamu exhaled softly and closed his eyes, as if dismissing the encounter altogether. But inside, he knew. This night was far from finished. The subway car continued its steady journey, the rhythmic clatter of steel against steel filling the heavy silence. The other passengers sat frozen, as if afraid that even breathing too loudly might provoke the thugs further. Kenjiro, still annoyed by his brief exchange with Isamu, leaned against a pole and exhaled sharply. He hated feeling unsettled, and something about the old man had done exactly that, but he wouldn't let it show. He needed to reassert control. Riku, eager to stir more chaos, spotted a new target, a young woman sitting alone near the door, gripping her purse tightly against her chest. She had been doing her best to shrink into her seat, hoping they wouldn't notice her, but they did. "Hey!" Riku called out, his voice dripping with false friendliness. He took a step toward her. She didn't answer. Kenjiro smirked. "That's rude, you know." Riku reached out and snatched the purse from her hands, holding it up like a prize. The woman gasped, her eyes wide with panic. "Let's see what we've got here," he mused, unzipping the bag. The moment he did, something in the subway shifted. It was subtle, a change in air, a presence stirring. Isamu opened his eyes. He had been sitting still, patient, like a stone amidst a storm. But now his fingers flexed slightly, as if preparing for something. And then, he moved. It was the smallest of gestures. His foot slid forward just an inch, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but it was precise, intentional, a warrior's movement. Kenjiro's instincts flared, though he couldn't explain why. Something about the way the old man adjusted his posture. It felt different. A memory flashed in his mind when he was a boy, watching his grandfather, an old fisherman, preparing to throw his net. The stance, the controlled breath, the absolute focus. Kenjiro shook it off. This was just some old man. But then, before anyone could react, Isamu struck. Not with a punch, not with a kick, but with a single, precise movement of his hand. The moment Riku reached into the purse, his wrist was caught in a grip so tight, so deliberate, that he couldn't move. The entire subway car froze. Riku's smirk vanished. He tried to pull away, but he couldn't. The old man's grip was like iron. "What the hell?" Riku grunted, struggling against the force holding him. Isamu's eyes remained locked onto him, his expression unshaken, unreadable. "Let go, old man," Kenjiro warned, his voice dangerously low. Isamu did not move, did not answer. He simply tightened his grip. Riku yelped as pain shot up his arm. His fingers involuntarily released the purse, which dropped harmlessly back onto the young woman's lap. She scrambled back in shock, watching in disbelief. The other passengers held their breath. For the first time, the power in the subway car had shifted. Kenjiro took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "I said, let him go." Slowly, methodically, Isamu released his grip. Riku stumbled backward, clutching his wrist as if it had been caught in a vice. He looked at the old man in shock. What the hell was that? That wasn't normal strength. That wasn't just a reflex, that was something else. Kenjiro's hands curled into fists. He wasn't about to be humiliated by some nobody. But before he could act, Isamu finally spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, but carried weight. Enough. It was just a single word, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Kenjiro hesitated. For the first time in years, he felt something close to doubt. He had no idea who this old man was, but something told him he had just made a very big mistake. The subway car remained suspended in tense silence. The passengers, who had once shrunk away in fear, now looked between Isamu and the thugs with wide, disbelieving eyes. No one had ever stood up to Kenjiro and his crew before, let alone an old man. Kenjiro's fists twitched, his pride bleeding from the wound Isamu had just inflicted, without even throwing a punch. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the way the old man had effortlessly controlled Riku, or the calm, absolute authority in his voice when he said, "Enough." Isamu, for his part, had already settled back into his seat. His hands rested lightly on his lap, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. If one didn't know better, they might think nothing had even happened, but Kenjiro knew better, and so did Isamu. Beneath his composed exterior, a conflict brewed inside him. The dilemma of the warrior. He had made a mistake, not in stopping Riku, but in allowing himself to intervene at all. For years he had walked the path of peace, choosing to leave behind the shadows of his past. There had been a time, a lifetime ago, when violence was all he knew, when the blade was an extension of his soul. But those days were gone. At least they were supposed to be. And yet tonight something had stirred inside him, a deep, dormant instinct, the need to protect. His master's words echoed in his mind. A warrior is not defined by his ability to fight, but by his choice not to. He had spent decades living by that lesson. So why then did his fingers still remember the feeling of Riku's wrist trapped in his grip? Why did he feel the old instincts awakening, like embers being fed fresh air? The growing threat. Kenjiro took a slow step forward, cracking his neck. His grin was gone. Now there was only cold, simmering anger. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he muttered. His voice had lost its usual mockery. There was something darker in it now. Isamu remained silent. The subway car rattled as it sped through the tunnels, the flickering overhead lights casting shifting shadows along the walls. Kenjiro tilted his head. "What are you? Some kind of martial arts master?" Isamu did not answer. Kenjiro's fingers curled. He wanted a reaction, but all he got was stillness. That made it worse. Riku, still nursing his wrist, gritted his teeth. "I say we teach this old man a lesson." Kenjiro exhaled slowly, controlling his frustration. No, not yet. He wouldn't rush in blind. That grip wasn't normal. There was something about this old man that didn't make sense. Instead, he let out a sharp chuckle. "Nah." Riku turned to him in confusion. "What?" Kenjiro forced a smirk. "Relax, man. He's just an old fool." He met Isamu's eyes one last time, his own gaze filled with silent warning. Not worth it, but the words felt like a lie. He had never backed down from a fight before. But tonight felt different. He needed to think. Kenjiro turned back toward the passengers, and with a single glance they all looked away, desperate to avoid his attention. That was what he was used to. That was the kind of control he had over people. But when his eyes returned to Isamu, the feeling wasn't there. The old man wasn't afraid, and that was going to be a problem. The decision. As the train rumbled toward its next stop, Isamu's hands slowly unclenched. He had made his choice. He would not escalate this further, not unless he had to. But in his heart, he knew the night wasn't over yet. The subway rattled on, the tension in the car thick and unrelenting. Though Kenjiro and his crew had backed off, for now, everyone knew it wasn't over. It was never that simple. Kenjiro leaned against the pole near the center of the train, his jaw clenched, his eyes flicking toward Isamu every few seconds. He didn't like this feeling. This uncertainty. The old man wasn't normal. He couldn't explain why, but deep down something told him, this isn't a man you want to fight. And that made him want to fight even more. Across the car, Isamu remained seated, his eyes closed once again, his breathing steady, calm, controlled. But he wasn't resting. He was listening. He could hear the shifting of feet, the way Kenjiro's breathing had changed ever so slightly, more measured, more calculating. He was thinking, not acting out of impulse anymore. That made him dangerous. But Isamu wasn't the only one who had noticed. A voice, quiet but firm, whispered near him. "Who are you?" Isamu opened his eyes and turned his head slightly. A young man sat a few seats away, gripping the metal bar beside him. He had sharp eyes, filled not with fear, but something else, determination. His hair was slightly disheveled, his hands clenched into fists. His name was Haruto. Haruto had been watching everything. He had seen the moment Isamu had effortlessly controlled Riku, had felt the shift in power, the way fear had cracked for the first time. And something inside him stirred. He wasn't like the other passengers. He wasn't content with just looking away, hoping the danger would pass. For years he had hated people like Kenjiro, those who took what they wanted, who fed off fear, who made the world feel smaller for everyone else. But he had never done anything about it, until now. "You're not just some old man," Haruto whispered, his eyes locked on Isamu. "Are you?" Isamu studied the young man. He saw the way his fists were clenched, the tension in his jaw, the fire in his gaze. And for the first time that night, Isamu saw himself, his younger self, reflected in someone else. He exhaled softly. "Why do you ask?" Haruto hesitated, then glanced toward Kenjiro and his crew, making sure they weren't listening. "Because I think you're the only one here who can stop them." Isamu's expression didn't change. "And what makes you think I should?" Haruto stiffened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You saw what they did, what they've been doing." His voice lowered, but his intensity sharpened. They've been terrorizing people for months. No one stands up to them. Isamu was silent. Haruto's grip on the bar tightened. But you did. A pause. Isamu turned his gaze forward again, staring at his own reflection in the subway window. He thought back to his youth, the days when he was not an old man sitting quietly in a subway car, but a warrior, a protector, when he still believed that fighting for others was not just a duty, but a purpose. Had he been wrong to let that part of himself die? He looked at Haruto again, young, strong, brave. Someone who, unlike the others, still had hope. Perhaps the world still needed warriors after all. Isamu closed his eyes again, his voice barely above a whisper. Not yet. Haruto blinked. What? The subway slowed as it approached the next station. Kenjiro exhaled sharply and pushed off the pole. He stretched, rolling his shoulders, his smirk returning. All right, boys. We're not done here. Riku grinned. Not even close. Haruto turned back to Isamu. They're going to do something. You know that, right? Isamu opened his eyes. He already knew, because this night was far from over. The subway doors slid open with a metallic hiss. A few passengers took their chance to escape, stepping off in hurried strides, their heads down, choosing silence over confrontation. But the ones who remained, those too afraid to move or too unfortunate to have farther destinations, could only watch in anxious stillness. Kenjiro stretched his neck with a slow crack, rolling his shoulders. His smirk had returned, but this time there was no humor in it, only calculation. Riku and Daiichi stood beside him, their confidence restored. Whatever doubt the old man had instilled in them earlier, it was gone now. They had time to think, time to convince themselves of one truth. Isamu was just an old man. And they were young, strong, and ruthless. Kenjiro glanced at the remaining passengers, his gaze lingering on the ones who had dared to watch. Haruto, the young woman, the businessman. He let his stare hang on each of them for a few extra seconds, a silent warning. Then his eyes settled back on Isamu, the real problem. Isamu remained still, his presence a sharp contrast to the brewing violence around him. He was no longer meditating. His eyes were open, locked onto Kenjiro, but his posture relaxed, controlled, as if he already knew how this would end. Kenjiro didn't like that. The train jolted forward again, the doors sealing shut, trapping them together for at least another 5 minutes until the next stop. And then, the betrayal came. A voice spoke from the other side of the train. Hey, Kenjiro. It wasn't Riku. It wasn't Daiichi. It was someone else. A man, seated near the middle of the car, finally looked up from beneath the brim of his cap. He was in his late 40s, a rugged face with deep lines carved by time and hardship. His jacket was slightly worn, the kind of man who had seen his fair share of fights, and now he was choosing a side. Kenjiro's smirk deepened. Well, well. He took a few slow steps toward the man. Didn't know we had a friend in the house. The man shrugged. Not a friend, he corrected. Just don't like people thinking they can stand up to you. Haruto stiffened. You've got to be kidding me. Isamu, however, did not react. His expression remained unreadable. The betrayal wasn't surprising. There were always those who bent when fear pressed down on them. Some did it to survive, others, they did it to feel powerful, to align themselves with the stronger side before it was too late. And this man? He had chosen wrong. Kenjiro chuckled, shoving his hands into his pockets. See? This guy gets it. Smart people don't pick fights they can't win. He turned back to Isamu, his smirk widening. Unlike some, the man in the jacket stood up slowly, his presence shifting the balance of power in the car. Now it wasn't just Kenjiro and his gang. Now it was 4 against 1. The businessman swallowed hard. The young woman clutched her purse again. Haruto's knuckles turned white against the subway pole. Kenjiro glanced at the older man. What's your name? The man shrugged. Doesn't matter. Kenjiro laughed. All right. Doesn't matter. He turned to Isamu. Guess that means you're really outnumbered now, Grandpa. A long, quiet pause. Then, Isamu did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a smirk, not arrogance, just a small, knowing smile. Kenjiro's amusement faltered. You think this is funny? He snapped. Isamu exhaled, his voice calm as still water. I think it's sad. Kenjiro's jaw tightened. Sad. Isamu tilted his head ever so slightly. His eyes, sharp despite his age, landed on the man in the jacket. You've already lost. The man frowned. What are you talking about? Kenjiro scoffed. Yeah? "How do you figure that, old man?" Isamu finally moved. He lifted his hand, not in violence but in gesture, a simple motion directing everyone's gaze to the other passengers, because something had changed. A few minutes ago, the passengers had been terrified. They had shrunk away, avoiding eye contact, desperate to go unnoticed. But now they were watching. Their eyes were no longer filled with helplessness, but with something else, something dangerous, hope. Kenjiro followed Isamu's gaze, and for the first time he saw it too. A shift, a crack in the fear that he had always relied on. And in that moment, he realized what the old man had done. Without throwing a punch, without raising his voice, he had already changed everything. Kenjiro clenched his jaw. Shh! His fingers twitched. This wasn't over. Not yet. The subway car was silent, but the energy inside it had changed. Kenjiro could feel it. Something was slipping. Fear. The thing he had always counted on. The thing that had always kept people quiet. Submissive. It was still there, lingering in the air, but it wasn't absolute anymore. And it was because of him. The old man. Kenjiro narrowed his eyes at Isamu, who still sat with perfect stillness, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his breathing slow and controlled. He didn't look like a threat, but he was. The moment he had stopped Riku, the way he had spoken, the way he had moved without fear, that was the first crack in the foundation. Now Kenjiro could feel more cracks forming. The passengers weren't as afraid as they should be. Even the ones who were still scared were watching. That was dangerous because people who watched, who paid attention, were one step away from acting. Kenjiro gritted his teeth. No, he wouldn't let this happen. He glanced toward his new ally, the man in the worn jacket. "If you're with us," Kenjiro said, "then prove it." The man hesitated, just for a second, but Kenjiro caught it. And so did Isamu, the mind of a warrior. Isamu had already read the man's body language, the slight hesitation, the way his fingers twitched at his side. This man wasn't truly committed. He had chosen the wrong side, but he hadn't given his soul to it yet. That was something Isamu could use, because battles were never won with just brute strength. They were won with strategy, with patience. He had learned that lesson decades ago in a different kind of fight. A true warrior does not swing his blade without thought. He studies the battlefield. He finds the cracks in the enemy's armor, and when the moment is right, he strikes. And so Isamu waited. Kenjiro, growing impatient, snapped his fingers. "Oi, did you hear me?" The man in the jacket flinched. Isamu saw it, and so did Haruto. The young man had been watching everything. He had seen the hesitation, the moment of doubt in the so-called ally, and he understood. Hope had started to spread. Haruto shifted in his seat, finally turning toward Kenjiro with defiance in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Haruto said, his voice calm but pointed. "Afraid of an old man?" Kenjiro's gaze snapped to him. There it was, the moment the dynamic changed. Because before it had been just Isamu. Now someone else had joined the fight. Kenjiro's lips curled. "You want to be a hero, kid?" Haruto's jaw clenched. "I want to live in a world where people like you don't win." Kenjiro's smirk faltered just slightly, not because of Haruto's words, but because of what they meant. More cracks, more shifting. For the first time, this wasn't just his show, and it was all because of that damn old man. Kenjiro exhaled slowly. Fine. If the kid wanted to step in, let him. Let's see how much fight he really had. He took a step closer to Haruto, but then Isamu moved. Not a big movement, just a simple shift, but it was deliberate. Kenjiro stopped. He hadn't realized it before, but he was reacting to him now. He was adjusting based on what the old man did. That realization made something cold settle in his stomach. He didn't like it. Not at all. The calm before the storm Isamu, meanwhile, had already decided. The battle was close. Not the physical one. That would come later. The real battle was happening now. And the strategy? It was working. Because Kenjiro wasn't just fighting to hurt people anymore. He was fighting for control, and the harder he fought for it, the more he was losing it. Isamu slowly exhaled through his nose, his fingers flexing briefly before relaxing again. Not yet, but soon. The inevitable clash. Kenjiro felt it too. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. This was slipping from his hands. His frustration boiled over. And then finally he made his decision. No more waiting. No more games. It was time to end this. Kenjiro turned to Isamu, his expression shifting into something colder, more dangerous. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, old man," he muttered, "but you've got about 30 seconds before I make you regret ever getting on this train." The passengers held their breath. Haruto tensed, and Isamu. He simply looked up, his expression unreadable. Kenjiro took one step forward, and Isamu finally spoke. "Then come." Kenjiro froze. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't hunting prey. It felt like he had just walked into a fight he wasn't ready for. The subway hurtled forward, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The subway car hummed along the tracks, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly, casting long shadows against the metal walls. Tension hung thick in the air. Kenjiro stood rigid, his eyes locked onto Isamu, trying to decipher what made this old man so different. The passengers barely breathed, afraid to break the silence. But Haruto, he was watching closely. Something was happening. Something bigger than just a fight. A lesson in honor. Kenjiro exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. "You think you're some kind of badass, huh, Grandpa?" His voice was lighter now, but it was forced, an attempt to disguise his unease. Isamu remained motionless. Kenjiro hated that. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. But then, Isamu finally spoke. "You mistake silence for weakness," he said, his voice calm. "But silence is merely the space between decisions." Kenjiro scoffed. "Oh, great, he's a philosopher." But Haruto leaned in, because he understood something Kenjiro didn't. Isamu wasn't just talking, he was teaching, and the lesson, it was about control. Isamu shifted his gaze to Haruto. "A true warrior does not seek conflict," Haruto swallowed. "But what if there's no choice?" Isamu held his stare. "Then he ensures that when he acts, he does so with purpose." A past unveiled Kenjiro clicked his tongue. "Enough of this old man wisdom crap." He took a step forward. "You're all talk. Let's see if you can still stand after I—" "Kenjiro." The way Isamu said his name stopped him cold. No mockery, no anger, just a quiet knowing. And then Isamu stood, slowly, effortlessly, with the kind of grace that belonged to someone much younger. Kenjiro's pulse quickened, because suddenly, the old man didn't seem old at all. The subway's fluorescent light gleamed off a faint scar running down Isamu's hand, barely visible against his weathered skin, and Kenjiro recognized it. Not the scar itself, but the kind of scar. A fighter's scar, a warrior's mark. Kenjiro's smirk faltered. "What the hell are you?" Isamu exhaled softly. "A man who has fought more battles than you can count." Kenjiro clenched his fists. "That's supposed to scare me?" Isamu shook his head. "No, it is a warning." Kenjiro's heart pounded. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Isamu turned slightly toward Haruto. "Courage is not found in aggression, nor in revenge, but in standing for what is right, even when fear tells you to run." Haruto stiffened, absorbing every word, and Kenjiro felt it. That shift, that moment where control slipped from his hands completely. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was about something bigger, and deep down, Kenjiro realized he had already lost. The train lurched forward, its brakes hissing as the next station neared. This was it. The moment where everything came to a head. Kenjiro clenched his jaw. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. With a sharp step forward, he raised his fist, and Isamu moved. A flash of motion. A shift in weight. And suddenly, Kenjiro's entire world turned upside down. The final fight had begun. The subway car lurched forward, its brakes hissing as it neared the next station. The fluorescent lights flickered once more, casting fleeting shadows across the faces of those trapped inside. And then, everything exploded into motion. Kenjiro lunged first, his fist cutting through the air like a blade. Fast, reckless, powerful, but not precise. Isamu barely moved. A subtle shift of weight, a step to the side, and Kenjiro's punch sailed past empty air. The thug stumbled forward, off balance, and before he could react, Isamu's hand was on his wrist. A single calculated movement, not a punch, not an attack, a redirection. With effortless grace, Isamu turned Kenjiro's momentum against him, twisting the young man's own force into a devastating arc of imbalance. Kenjiro's eyes widened as he lost control, his body flipping forward. And with a final precise shift, Isamu released him. Kenjiro crashed hard onto the subway floor, his back slamming against the cold steel. A choked breath escaped his lips as he struggled to process what had just happened. The entire car went silent. Passengers stared in disbelief. Haruto's heart pounded. Kenjiro, the terror of these subway rides, the man no one had ever dared to challenge, was lying flat on his back. And the old man, he hadn't even thrown a punch. The art of control. Kenjiro groaned, pushing himself up, rage flaring in his eyes. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing. Riku and Daiichi snapped out of their shock. "You bastard!" Riku snarled, rushing forward. Daiichi followed, his heavy fists swinging wildly. But Isamu remained in control. As Riku lunged, Isamu sidestepped with ease, catching the younger man's wrist in midair. A sharp twist, controlled but firm, sent Riku spinning off balance. He crashed into a subway pole, gripping it for support, his breath ragged. Daiichi, fueled by blind rage, threw a powerful haymaker. Big mistake. Isamu ducked effortlessly, the punch whooshing past his head before he shifted his stance, and lightly placed 2 fingers on Daiichi's chest. Just 2 fingers. A moment later, Daiichi's body froze, because he felt it. Not an attack, not brute force, but complete, unshakable control. Like a swordsman who had already won the duel before his blade was even drawn. The moment stretched longer than it should have, before Isamu finally gently pushed forward, and Daiichi, his entire body crumpled backward, crashing into a row of empty seats. The subway shook, and suddenly, the fight was no longer a fight. It was a lesson. Kenjiro's desperation. Kenjiro watched it all, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. What the hell was this old man? How was he doing this? Not overpowering them, but completely dismantling them. Kenjiro couldn't accept it. This was his world, his subway, his rules. He wouldn't let some frail old man take that away from him. He charged again, this time faster, more ruthless, no hesitation, no tricks, just pure brutality. A fist aimed at Isamu's ribs, a knee driving toward his stomach, a second strike reaching for his throat. But Isamu, he had already seen it coming. The final counter. With a fluid grace that defied his age, Isamu intercepted the first strike with his palm, deflecting it effortlessly. The knee. He angled his hip slightly, making Kenjiro's attack land on nothing but air. And the final blow, a desperate, rage-fueled punch aimed at his throat. Isamu caught it. His fingers closed around Kenjiro's fist. Tight, unbreakable. Kenjiro struggled, his muscles straining, but it was pointless. For the first time he felt fear, real, genuine fear, not because of pain, but because he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had lost. The subway rumbled forward, and for the first time in his life, Kenjiro was no longer the predator. He was the prey, the choice. The moment hung between them. Isamu could end this. He could strike. He could destroy. He could make Kenjiro feel everything he had inflicted on others, but he didn't. Instead, he simply held the young man's fist, not squeezing, not hurting, but containing. Then, in a voice softer than before, he spoke. "This is not your path." Kenjiro's breath hitched. "Power built on fear will crumble," Isamu continued. "But strength, true strength, is found in restraint." Kenjiro's chest heaved, his entire body trembling. For years, he had built his reputation on violence, on being the one people feared most. But now he was staring into the eyes of someone stronger than him, not because of what he could do, but because of what he chose not to do. The subway lurched, approaching the next stop. Kenjiro's body sagged, his fists unclenched, and for the first time in his life he didn't know what to do. The doors slid open, and the final choice was his to make. The subway doors opened, but no one moved. Kenjiro's fist remained trapped in Isamu's grip, his breath unsteady. He had lost. Before he could react, Riku snapped. Desperate, he grabbed a young woman, pressing a knife to her side. "Let her go," Haruto growled, stepping forward. Riku's eyes were wild. "I won't be a nobody." The knife never struck. Isamu moved. In an instant, he twisted Riku's wrist, making the blade drop harmlessly to the floor. Riku staggered back, his body trembling. The silence that followed was absolute. Kenjiro stared at his fallen crew. The power he once held? Gone. He turned to Isamu, chest heaving. "How are you?" Isamu's voice was steady. Someone who chose a different path. The train's chime warned of departure. Kenjiro swallowed his pride and stepped off. For the first time, he walked away. The doors slid shut, and the reign of fear was over. The subway car was changed. Fear had been replaced with something else: respect. Haruto sat beside Isamu, eyes filled with questions. "How did you do that?" Isamu's voice was quiet. "I have spent a lifetime learning when to act." The passengers, once terrified, now looked at Isamu with gratitude. A businessman gave him a nod. The young woman, now safe, whispered, "Thank you." The subway slowed. Isamu stood first. Haruto hesitated, then followed. "Teach me," Haruto said. Isamu paused, then offered the faintest smile. "Then walk with me." They stepped off the train. Elsewhere in the city, a man read a news article. His fingers tapped the table as he murmured, "So, you're still alive." The tea beside him grew cold, and far beyond, a new storm gathered. Subscribe for more stories of wisdom, strength, and the path of a warrior.